Captain Marcus Webb had been traveling through space for 15 years. He had seen things that would make most people question their own eyes. He had watched stars die and new ones being born. He had walked on planets where the ground was made of crystal and the sky burned purple. But nothing in his long career had prepared him for what he found hiding behind the water recycling unit on Deck 7. It started with the sounds. Small scratching noises in the walls, little movements in the corner of his vision, the kind of things that made a person think they were losing their mind after too many months in the black emptiness between stars. The cargo ship Wandering Hope was an old vessel. She had seen better days, but she was reliable. Marcus had bought her 12 years ago with every credit he had saved. She was his home now, more than any planet had ever been. He knew every creak of her metal bones, every whisper of her air systems, every hum of her engines. So when something new started making noise in her belly, he noticed right away. His crew noticed too. There were only 4 of them on this run. Elena, his first officer, had reported hearing something moving in the cargo hold. James, the young engineer, swore he saw a shadow dart behind the engine room equipment. Even old Dr. Patel, who had been traveling space since before Marcus was born, mentioned that something had been stealing food from the medical bay storage. Marcus decided it had to be a rat. It made sense. They had loaded cargo on Kepler Station 3 weeks ago. Rats were common on stations. They had adapted to space life just like humans had. They stowed away on ships and bred in the dark corners. Every captain dealt with them at some point. He set traps, he put out poison, he sealed every gap he could find. But the sounds continued. The food kept disappearing. And now, standing in the maintenance corridor on Deck 7, he was determined to catch the creature himself. The Wandering Hope was carrying medical supplies to a colony on the edge of human space. The colony was new, only established 5 years ago. They had sent an urgent request for antibiotics and surgical equipment. A sickness was spreading through their population. Children were dying. The payment for this delivery would keep his ship running for the next year, but Marcus would have made the trip for nothing if he had to. He understood what it meant to be alone and in need of help. The corridor was narrow and dark. The lights here had been flickering for months. James kept promising to fix them, but there was always something more urgent. Marcus moved slowly, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. He could hear the sound again, that soft scratching like tiny claws on metal. He got down on his hands and knees. The water recycling unit was a large machine that took up most of the wall. There was a small gap beneath it, just a few inches of space between the bottom of the unit and the floor. The sound was coming from there. Marcus aimed his flashlight into the gap. He expected to see the gleaming eyes of a rat, that familiar red reflection that space rats were known for. He was already planning how he would catch it, whether he should use his hands or go get a container. What he saw instead made him freeze completely. It was not a rat. It was not anything he had ever seen before. It was small, maybe the length of his hand from wrist to fingertip. It had scales that shimmered in the light, changing color as it moved. One moment they looked silver, the next they were deep blue, then shifting to green. It had 4 tiny legs, each ending in claws that looked sharp despite their size. It had wings, delicate and folded against its back, almost transparent like the wings of an insect, and it had a face with intelligent golden eyes that looked right at him, with an expression that seemed almost curious. It was a dragon, a tiny, impossible dragon. Marcus stayed very still. His heart was beating fast. He had seen many alien species in his travels. Some were friendly, some were dangerous, and most were simply different. But he had never seen anything like this. Dragons existed only in the old stories from Earth, in the myths and legends that humans had carried with them to the stars. They were not real. They could not be real. The creature made a small sound, something between a chirp and a purr. It tilted its head, studying him just as carefully as he was studying it. It did not seem afraid. If anything, it seemed curious about the giant human lying on the floor and shining a light at it. Marcus slowly lowered his flashlight. The creature blinked, adjusting to the dimmer light. He could see now that it was thin, too thin. Its ribs were visible beneath those beautiful scales. It was hungry. That explained the stolen food. Without thinking too much about what he was doing, Marcus reached into his pocket. He always carried a protein bar with him, a habit from his early days in space when meals were never guaranteed. He broke off a small piece and held it out toward the gap. The creature's nostrils flared, its golden eyes fixed on the food. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, carefully, it crept forward. Its movements were graceful despite its obvious weakness. It sniffed the offered food, looked at Marcus one more time, and then took the piece gently from his fingers. The touch was electric. Not literally, but something passed between them in that moment. Something Marcus could not explain. The creature ate the food in 2 quick bites, then looked up at him again, clearly hoping for more. Marcus gave it the rest of the protein bar, piece by piece. With each offering, the tiny dragon came a little closer. By the time the bar was gone, it had crawled out from under the recycling unit entirely. It sat in front of him now, its tail curled around its feet, those remarkable wings twitching slightly as it waited for more. The captain of the Wandering Hope, a man who had faced pirates and storms and the vast terror of empty space, sat on the floor of a dark corridor and fed a dragon from his hands. He wondered if he was dreaming. He wondered if he was losing his mind. But the weight of the creature when it climbed onto his palm was very real. The warmth of its small body was very real. The way it curled up and closed its eyes, trusting him completely, was very real. He needed to tell his crew. He needed to figure out where this creature had come from and what it was. But for now, in this quiet moment, he just sat there and watched it sleep in his hands. Elena did not believe him at first. She stood in the corridor with her arms crossed, looking at Marcus like he had finally lost the sanity that deep space was known for taking. Then he showed her the creature, still sleeping peacefully in a small box he had lined with a soft cloth, and her expression changed completely. James was called next, then Dr. Patel. They gathered in the mess hall, the 4 of them standing around the table where the box now sat. The dragon had woken up and was peering at all of them with those golden eyes, making small, curious sounds. Dr. Patel was the first to speak. She was the oldest among them, with gray hair and dark skin lined with the marks of a long life. She had been a military doctor before retiring to cargo ship work. And she had seen more strange things than any of them. She said it looked like the creatures from the old stories, the ones that Earth people used to believe in before they knew better. Dragons, worms, fire drakes. Every culture had some version of them. Winged serpents with scales and fire and ancient wisdom. But those were just myths, just stories to explain lightning and volcanoes and the fear of the dark. This creature was real. It was sitting right in front of them, eating small pieces of dried meat that James had fetched from the kitchen storage. Elena asked where it could have come from. They had only docked at Kepler Station, and she had never heard of anything like this being found in that sector. The station traded mostly in refined metals and agricultural products from the nearby farming colonies. Nothing exotic. Nothing alive except for the occasional livestock transport. Marcus thought about the cargo they had loaded. Medical supplies mostly, packed in standard containers with proper seals and documentation. But there had been one container that was different. It had been added at the last minute, a special request from the colony they were traveling to. The manifest said it contained historical artifacts being returned to their original owners. Marcus had not thought much about it at the time. He went down to the cargo hold to check. The container was there, strapped securely in place among the others. It was smaller than most, maybe 3 feet on each side, made of a metal that looked old and worn. There were symbols carved into its surface, patterns that seemed almost familiar but that Marcus could not identify. The container was locked, but the lock was broken. Someone or something had forced it open from the inside. The lid was slightly raised, and when Marcus lifted it completely, he found the interior lined with a material that looked like crystal. There was a depression in the center, shaped like a small bowl. The depression was empty now, but there were fragments of shell scattered around it, pieces of something that had once been whole, something that had hatched. Marcus understood then. The dragon had been an egg. It had been packed in this container probably for a long time, and somehow, during the journey, it had hatched. It had broken free and found its way into the ship, surviving on stolen food and hiding from the giant creatures that shared its space. He brought the container back to show the others. Dr. Patel examined the shell fragments with great interest. She said they were unlike anything she had ever seen. The material was not exactly mineral and not exactly organic. It was something in between, something that science had no name for. James suggested they contact the colony and tell them what they had found. Maybe they would know more about where this creature had come from and what it was. But communications at this distance were slow. It would take days for a message to reach the colony and days more for a reply to come back. In the meantime, they would have to figure out how to care for their unexpected passenger. The dragon, as they started calling it, seemed to prefer Marcus above all others. It would tolerate Elena and allow James to feed it, but it became agitated when Dr. Patel came too close. And it always returned to Marcus when given the choice. It would climb up his arm and settle on his shoulder, wrapping its tail around his neck for balance. It made soft purring sounds when he spoke to it, as if it understood his words even though that was impossible. Over the next few days, the creature grew stronger. Regular meals and warmth and safety allowed it to recover from whatever hardship it had endured during its time alone. Its scales became brighter, its movements more energetic, and its wings began to stretch and flex as if preparing for flight. Elena spent hours in the ship's database, searching for any record of similar creatures. She found nothing in the scientific archives. No expedition had ever documented a life form matching this description. No zoological catalog included anything remotely like it. But she did find something in the cultural records, in the vast collection of human mythology that scholars had preserved during the migration from Earth. Dragons appeared in the stories of almost every human culture. Chinese dragons that brought rain and good fortune. European dragons that guarded treasures and tested heroes. Mesoamerican serpents with feathered wings that represented wisdom and creation. African dragons that lived in rivers and controlled the flow of water. Japanese dragons that governed the seas and sky. The stories were different, but some elements remained the same across all of them. Dragons were powerful. Dragons were intelligent. Dragons could live for thousands of years. And dragons chose their companions carefully, forming bonds with humans who proved themselves worthy. Elena showed these records to Marcus. He looked at the tiny creature sleeping on his shoulder, its warm body rising and falling with each breath. He did not feel worthy of anything. He was just a cargo ship captain, a man who had spent his life running from one place to another, never belonging anywhere. But the dragon had chosen him, for whatever reason, and he would not betray that trust. The problems started 3 days before they were scheduled to reach the colony. The long-range sensors detected another ship coming up fast from behind them. The signature matched a configuration that Marcus recognized immediately, and his blood went cold. Raiders, space pirates, the kind of people who preyed on cargo ships in the empty spaces between colonies. They disabled vessels, killed crews, and took everything of value. The colony they were traveling to was remote enough that law enforcement rarely patrolled these routes. It was a perfect hunting ground for those who lived outside the law. Marcus had dealt with raiders before. Twice in his career he had been attacked. The first time he had surrendered and lost everything. The second time he had fought back and barely survived. He had sworn after that to avoid conflict whenever possible, to run when he could, and hide when he could not. But the Wandering Hope was not a fast ship. The raiders would catch them long before they reached the colony. And they were carrying medical supplies that sick people desperately needed. Surrender was not an option. Not this time. He called his crew to the bridge. Elena, James, Dr. Patel. They stood around the navigation console, looking at the red dot that represented the approaching threat. The dragon sat on Marcus's shoulder, watching with those golden eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should. They had 12 hours before the raiders would be in weapons range, 12 hours to come up with a plan, 12 hours before everything changed. Marcus looked at the stars spread out before them, cold and distant and beautiful. He had been running for 15 years. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to fight. The dragon made a small sound, something that almost sounded like agreement. Its scales flickered with colors Marcus had not seen before, deep reds and bright oranges, like flames trapped beneath the surface. The creature's golden eyes met his, and in that moment, he felt something pass between them again. A message without words, a promise of fire. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The hours passed slowly, each minute stretching into an eternity as the red dot on the sensor display crept closer. Marcus had gathered his crew in the cargo hold, away from the bridge where they might be monitored by the approaching vessel. Raiders often had equipment that could intercept ship communications and scan for life signs. He wanted to keep their plans private for as long as possible. The cargo hold was cold, filled with the containers of medical supplies that people were counting on. Somewhere in a colony on the edge of human space, children were sick and dying. Their parents were praying for help that was still days away. Marcus felt the weight of that responsibility like a physical burden pressing down on his shoulders. The dragon felt it too. The creature had become more alert since they first detected the raiders. It no longer slept peacefully on Marcus's shoulder. Instead, it watched everything with those intelligent golden eyes, its small body tense and ready. The colors in its scales continued to shift, cycling through shades of red and orange that reminded Marcus of flames dancing in darkness. Elena spread out a diagram of the Wandering Hope on a crate top. The ship's layout was simple: bridge at the front, engine room at the back, cargo hold in the middle, crew quarters and common areas above. There were only a handful of entry points that raiders could use to board them, and most of those could be sealed and defended. The problem was that they were only 4 people. Raiders typically operated in groups of 10 or more, and they were experienced fighters. They had weapons and armor and the willingness to kill without hesitation. Marcus's crew had a few old pulse pistols, a hunting rifle that James used when they stopped on worlds with game animals, and whatever tools they could use as weapons. It was not enough. James suggested they could vent atmosphere in certain sections of the ship, flood them with toxic gas from the engine coolant systems, create barriers that would slow the raiders down even if they could not stop them completely. It was a defensive strategy, meant to buy time rather than win a fight. But time for what? Dr. Patel reminded them that the colony needed those supplies urgently. Every day of delay meant more deaths. They could not simply hide and hope the raiders would go away. If the raiders took the cargo, the mission failed. If the raiders destroyed the ship, everything failed. They needed to find a way to win, not just survive. Marcus listened to his crew debate options that all seemed hopeless. He felt the dragon shift on his shoulder, its claws gripping his jacket tighter. The creature made a soft sound, something between a growl and a purr, and he felt warmth spreading from where it touched him. Not uncomfortable heat, but something soothing, something that pushed back against the cold fear that was trying to take hold of his heart. He thought about the old stories Elena had shown him. Dragons that protected treasures. Dragons that fought alongside heroes. Dragons that could breathe fire hot enough to melt steel and strong enough to destroy armies. But this dragon was tiny, barely larger than his hand. It could not possibly have that kind of power. Could it? The dragon looked at him as if it had heard his thoughts. Its golden eyes held something that might have been amusement or challenge or both. It opened its small mouth, showing teeth that were sharp and white, and made a sound that was definitely a growl this time. Then it turned its head toward the bulkhead that faced the approaching raider ship, and the colors in its scales intensified until it seemed to glow with inner fire. Marcus felt something then, a connection that went beyond words or thoughts, an awareness of what the creature was, what it could become, what it was offering. The dragon was not helpless. It was young, yes, small and newly hatched and still learning about the universe it had been born into, but there was power inside it, power that was ancient and terrible and waiting to be unleashed. It was asking him if he wanted that power, if he was willing to use it. He did not understand how he knew this. The knowledge simply appeared in his mind, clear and undeniable. The dragon could grow. It could become strong enough to help them. But that growth required something from him. Trust. Faith. A bond that went both ways. The creature was offering itself as a partner, an ally, a weapon. All Marcus had to do was accept. He looked at his crew. Elena, who had served with him for 8 years and never once complained about the hard life of cargo shipping. James, young and eager, and still believing that the universe was full of wonder rather than danger. Dr. Patel, who had retired from a comfortable hospital position on a central world to help the people who lived on the edges of civilization. They were good people. They deserved better than to die at the hands of raiders in the cold emptiness between stars. Marcus made his choice. He reached up and gently touched the dragon's head, running his fingers along those shimmering scales. He opened himself to whatever connection the creature was offering. He accepted. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Power flooded through him, not physical power but something else. Awareness expanded until he could feel the entire ship around him, every system and circuit and molecule of air. He could sense the approaching raiders, their ship hungry and predatory, their crew eager for violence. He could feel the distant colony, its population suffering and hoping, their need reaching out across space like a prayer. And he could feel the dragon, really feel it now. Not just as a weight on his shoulder, but as a presence in his mind. It was old, impossibly old, older than humanity itself. It had slept for millennia in that crystal container, waiting for the right moment to wake, waiting for the right person to bond with. It had been watching Marcus since it hatched, testing him, judging him, and it had found him worthy. The creature's name was not something that could be spoken in human sounds, but Marcus understood it anyway. It was a name that meant fire and flight and freedom, a name that carried the weight of ages and the promise of power. He called it Spark because that was the closest his human mind could come to understanding what it was. A spark of something ancient and eternal, a beginning and an end and everything in between. Elena was staring at him. Her mouth was open, her eyes wide. She said his name, asked if he was all right, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. Marcus looked at her and smiled. He told her they were going to be fine. He told her they were going to fight. The raiders made contact 6 hours later. A harsh voice came through the communication system, demanding that they stop their engines and prepare to be boarded. The voice belonged to a man who called himself Captain Vex, leader of a group that had terrorized this sector for the past 2 years. He listed the ships he had taken, the crews he had killed, the cargo he had claimed. He did this to frighten them, to break their will before the fighting even started. It was a strategy that had worked many times before. Marcus responded calmly. He told Captain Vex that the Wandering Hope was carrying medical supplies for a sick colony. He told him that children would die if those supplies did not arrive. He offered to give the raiders some of their cargo, half of everything they carried, if they would let them continue on their way. It was a reasonable offer, a peaceful solution that would benefit everyone. Captain Vex laughed. He said he did not make deals with cargo captains. He said he would take everything they had, including their lives. He said his crew was already preparing to board, and nothing could stop them now. Marcus ended the communication. He looked at his crew, gathered on the bridge around him. Elena at the weapons console, though their few guns would do little against the raider ship. James at engineering, ready to implement whatever desperate measures they had discussed. Dr. Patel with her medical kit, prepared to treat wounds that they hoped would never come. Spark sat on his shoulder, no longer small and fragile, but somehow larger now, more present. The dragon's scales were blazing with color, reds and oranges and yellows that seemed to contain actual heat. Its wings, once folded and still, were spreading wide, stretching to their full span for the first time since it had hatched. Those wings were larger than they should have been, extending far beyond what a creature of that size should possess. The raiders matched velocity with the Wandering Hope and began extending their boarding tube. Marcus watched on the external cameras as the connection was made, as the seals locked into place, as the raider crew prepared to force their way through. He counted 12 of them, armed with weapons that could cut through their crew like water through paper. 12 killers coming to take everything and leave them floating dead in the void. Marcus walked to the airlock where the boarders would enter. His crew called after him, asking what he was doing, begging him to wait. But he kept walking, and Spark kept growing. By the time he reached the airlock door, the dragon was no longer sitting on his shoulder. It was flying beside him, its wings beating steadily, its body now the size of a large cat. And it was still growing. The airlock door exploded inward. The raiders came through in a rush, weapons raised, voices shouting. They saw Marcus standing alone in the corridor, apparently unarmed, apparently foolish. They laughed and raised their guns to shoot him down. Then they saw the dragon. Spark had grown to the size of a tiger now. Its scales blazed like a furnace, casting shadows on the walls that danced and flickered. Its eyes were no longer just golden, but seemed to contain actual flames, burning behind the pupils like windows into a star. It opened its mouth and roared, a sound that was nothing like what a creature should make, a sound that was fire and fury and ancient power. And then it breathed. The flame that came from Spark's mouth was not normal fire. It was something else, something that existed in the spaces between physics as humans understood them. It was hot enough to melt the raiders' weapons before they could fire. It was bright enough to blind them even when they closed their eyes. It was powerful enough to throw them backward through the boarding tube and into their own ship, tumbling and screaming and utterly terrified. Marcus walked forward through the fire, untouched by heat that should have reduced him to ash. The bond with Spark protected him, wrapped him in power that made him something more than human for these desperate moments. He stepped onto the raider ship, surrounded by flames, followed by a dragon that was now the size of a horse and still growing. Captain Vex was waiting on the bridge of his ship. He had watched everything through cameras, had seen his crew defeated in seconds by something that should not exist. But he was not a man who surrendered easily. He had a gun pointed at Marcus as the cargo captain walked through the door and his finger was on the trigger. He demanded to know what that creature was. He demanded to know how this was possible. He demanded answers to questions that had no answers in any language he knew. Marcus told him the truth. He said he did not fully understand what Spark was or where it had come from. He said the dragon had chosen him, had bonded with him, had offered its power to protect the people and cargo on his ship. He said the raiders could leave now, turn around, and never come back to this sector, and no one else needed to be hurt. He said this was their one chance to survive. Captain Vex's answer was to pull the trigger. The bullet never reached Marcus. Spark moved faster than thought, faster than light seemed to travel, and its wing swept the projectile out of the air. Then the dragon fixed its blazing eyes on the raider captain and growled, a sound that made the walls shake and the lights flicker. Captain Vex dropped his weapon. His hands were trembling. His face had gone pale. He was a man who had faced danger many times, who had killed and nearly been killed, who thought he feared nothing in the universe. But he had never faced anything like this. He had never looked into eyes that burned with fire older than his species. Marcus told him again to leave, to take his ship and his crew and go, to never prey on cargo ships or colonies or anyone else again. He said that Spark would remember him now, and if he ever caused harm to innocent people again, the dragon would find him no matter how far he ran or how well he hid. The raider captain believed him. He believed every word. He gave orders to his surviving crew, and within minutes the boarding tube was retracting and the raider ship was pulling away. Marcus watched it go. Watched it shrink to a dot on the sensors and then disappear into the infinite darkness between stars. Spark was shrinking too, now that the danger had passed. The massive dragon that had breathed fire and terrified hardened criminals was becoming small again, returning to the size it had been before. By the time Marcus walked back to his own ship, it was once again small enough to sit on his shoulder, curled up and purring softly as if nothing had happened. His crew was waiting for him. Elena and James and Dr. Patel, all of them staring at him with expressions that mixed amazement and fear and something that might have been awe. They had questions. They had so many questions. But Marcus was tired, more tired than he had ever been, and the answers would have to wait. He told them to set course for the colony. The sick children still needed their medicine. The mission was not over yet. Dr. Patel stepped forward and examined him carefully. She checked his vital signs, looked into his eyes, asked him how he felt. He told her he was fine, just exhausted. She did not look entirely convinced, but she nodded and stepped back. James went to engineering to make sure the ship had not been damaged during the confrontation. Elena returned to the bridge to monitor their course and watch for any sign that the raiders might return. Dr. Patel stayed with Marcus, watching him and the dragon with eyes that saw more than most. She asked him what happened in those moments when the dragon grew. She asked him what it felt like to walk through fire without burning. She asked him if he was still the same person he had been before. Marcus thought about those questions carefully before answering. He said he was still himself, still the same cargo ship captain who had spent 15 years wandering the stars. But he was also something more now, something connected to a power that he barely understood. Spark had given him a gift, or maybe a responsibility. He was not sure which word fit better. The dragon made a soft sound, something that seemed like agreement. It nestled closer to his neck, its small body warm and comfortable against his skin. Whatever it was, this bond between human and dragon, it was real and permanent. They were partners now. They would face whatever came next together. 3 days later, they arrived at the colony. The medical supplies were unloaded quickly, rushed to the hospital where sick children were waiting. Marcus stood on the landing pad and watched the activity, watched people running back and forth with crates of antibiotics and surgical equipment, watched the relief on faces that had been expecting the worst. A woman approached him. She was older, with gray hair and tired eyes, but she stood straight and her voice was strong. She introduced herself as the colony governor and thanked him for making the delivery despite the dangers. She said they had heard about the raiders in this sector, had worried that their shipment would never arrive. Marcus told her about the encounter without mentioning the dragon. He said the raiders had changed their minds and left them alone. He did not explain why. Some things were not ready to be shared with the wider universe yet. But the governor was looking at his shoulder, where Spark sat watching everything with those ancient golden eyes. She asked what kind of creature that was. She said she had never seen anything like it. Marcus smiled and said it was a very old friend. The governor did not push for more details. She had enough problems to deal with without worrying about mysterious animals on cargo ships. Before they left, she gave Marcus something. A small data chip that contained coordinates and a name. She said the artifacts they had been carrying, the ones in the crystal container, had come from a world deep in unexplored space, a world that her colonists had found years ago during a survey mission. They had taken what they found there without understanding what it was. Now, with the egg hatched and the creature alive, maybe someone should go back and learn the truth. Marcus took the chip and thanked her. He looked at Spark, and the dragon looked back at him with an expression that might have been anticipation. They both knew what this meant. The story was not over. It was only beginning. The coordinates on the data chip led them far beyond the borders of human space. For 3 weeks, the Wandering Hope traveled through regions that no human ship had mapped, past stars that had no names and worlds that had never felt the footsteps of people. The journey was long and strange, filled with sights that made even veteran spacers like Marcus feel small and humble. Spark grew restless as they traveled. The dragon spent hours pressed against the observation windows, staring out at the passing stars with an intensity that seemed almost like recognition. Sometimes it would make sounds that were almost like words, as if trying to communicate something that human ears could not quite catch. The bond between Marcus and the creature had grown stronger since the encounter with the raiders, and he could feel echoes of what Spark was feeling: excitement, anticipation, and something that might have been fear. Elena spent the journey studying everything they knew about the mysterious world they were approaching. The colony governor had provided more than just coordinates. There were survey records, images taken from orbit, and notes from the team that had first discovered the place. What they described was impossible, but then again, so was the tiny dragon sleeping on their captain's shoulder. The world had no official name, just a catalog number that meant nothing. It was larger than Earth, with gravity about 20% stronger than standard. The atmosphere was breathable but thin, with oxygen levels that would make physical activity difficult for humans. The surface was covered in mountains and valleys and vast open plains, all of them decorated with structures that could not have been natural. Ruins. Massive ruins that stretched for miles in every direction. Towers that reached toward the sky like fingers grasping for something just out of reach. Domes that covered entire valleys, their surfaces still gleaming after unknown millennia. Roads that connected cities across continents, perfectly straight and perfectly preserved despite the passage of ages. And everywhere, carved into stone and metal and materials that the survey team could not identify, were images of dragons. The colonists who found this place had not understood what they were looking at. They had taken samples of the strange crystal material they found in one of the smaller structures, loaded them onto their ship, and returned to their colony to analyze what they had discovered. They had not realized that one of those crystals was an egg. They had not realized that they were carrying a living being out of its home and across the galaxy to hatch among strangers. Spark knew, though. The dragon had always known where it came from, even if it could not communicate that knowledge in words. As they drew closer to the world, Marcus could feel the creature's emotions more clearly through their bond. Joy at returning home, sadness at what had been lost, and a growing sense of purpose that Marcus did not yet understand. They entered orbit on a cold morning by the ship's artificial clock. Below them, the ruins spread across the planet's surface, like the skeleton of a civilization that had once spanned continents. Marcus stood on the bridge, looking down at a world that should not exist, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him. Elena found a landing site near one of the larger structures. The approach was difficult, with the thin atmosphere providing less lift than their shuttle was designed for. But she managed to bring them down safely on a flat plaza of polished stone. Through the windows, they could see the towers rising around them, ancient and silent and impossibly tall. The crew gathered by the airlock, checking their breathing equipment and supplies. The air outside was not deadly, but it was thin enough to cause problems during extended activity. They would need to be careful, move slowly, and watch each other for signs of altitude sickness. Spark did not seem to need any such precautions. The dragon had grown to the size of a large dog during the descent, and it stood by the airlock with obvious eagerness. When the door opened, it bounded out onto the ancient stone and looked back at Marcus with an expression that clearly said to hurry up. The plaza was vast, larger than anything Marcus had ever seen on any human world. The stone beneath their feet was perfectly smooth, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the alien sky above. The towers around them rose hundreds of feet into the air, their surfaces covered with carvings that showed dragons of every size and shape. Flying dragons, sleeping dragons, dragons breathing fire and ice and lightning. Dragons that looked exactly like Spark, and dragons that were completely different. Dr. Patel was scanning everything with her medical equipment, which was not designed for archaeological work, but was the best they had. She said the readings made no sense. The structures were incredibly old, possibly millions of years, but they showed almost no degradation. Whatever civilization had built them had used materials and techniques that humans had never imagined. James was equally amazed, but for different reasons. He was an engineer, trained to understand how things were built and how they worked. The towers around them should not be standing after so much time. The plaza should have cracked and crumbled. The laws of physics that he knew suggested that nothing could last this long without active maintenance. Yet here it was, perfect and preserved, as if the builders had left just yesterday. Spark led them across the plaza and into the largest of the towers. The interior was dark at first, but as they entered, lights began to glow along the walls. Not electric lights or fire, but something else, something that seemed to come from the stone itself. The dragon's scales shimmered in response, matching the colors of the illumination as if communicating with the ancient structure. The tower was hollow inside, with a spiral ramp leading upward along the inner walls. They climbed for what felt like hours, passing level after level of chambers and corridors that branched off into unexplored darkness. Some of the chambers contained objects that might have been furniture or equipment or works of art. Others were empty, except for more carvings of dragons. Near the top of the tower, they found what they had come for. It was a room unlike any other they had passed. The walls were covered not with carvings, but with something that looked like screens, though made of a material that was definitely not glass or plastic or anything humans had ever used. The screens showed images that moved and changed, replaying scenes from a time so long ago that Marcus could barely comprehend it. He saw dragons flying through alien skies, thousands of them, millions of them, filling the air with color and fire. He saw cities that made the ruins outside look like primitive villages, cities that floated in the clouds and reached down into the planet's core. He saw a civilization that had mastered not just their world, but their entire galaxy, that had traveled to other dimensions and touched the fabric of reality itself. And he saw the end. A darkness that came from beyond the stars, a threat that even the dragons could not defeat. They fought, those ancient beings, fought with all their power and all their wisdom. They sacrificed everything to push the darkness back. And in the end, when victory was won at a cost too terrible to imagine, only a few of them remained. Those survivors made a choice. They could not rebuild what had been lost, could not restore their civilization from such complete devastation. But they could preserve something for the future. They could leave seeds scattered across the galaxy, waiting for the right moment and the right beings to wake them. Eggs. Thousands of eggs, hidden in crystal containers, placed on worlds throughout the universe, sleeping for millions of years, waiting for the day when someone would find them and form the bonds that would bring the dragons back to life. Marcus understood now. He understood what Spark was, what the bond between them meant, what his role in this ancient story had become. The dragons had not chosen him specifically, not him personally. They had left their eggs in places where young species would eventually find them. Species that were curious enough to explore, compassionate enough to care for helpless creatures, and brave enough to fight when fighting was necessary. Humanity fit that description. Perhaps many species did. But it was humanity that had found this particular egg, humanity that had carried it across the stars, and a human who had formed the first bond with a dragon in millions of years. Spark was sitting beside him, no longer small, but not enormous either. It was the size of a large wolf now, its scales shimmering with colors that reflected the images on the walls. Those golden eyes were watching him, and through the bond, Marcus could feel what the dragon was trying to say. There were more eggs out there, scattered across the galaxy, waiting to be found. Some had probably been discovered and destroyed by species who did not understand what they had. Others were still sleeping in hidden places, waiting for someone to stumble upon them. And some, perhaps, were waking up right now, forming bonds with beings who would help bring the dragons back into the universe. Marcus and Spark were not alone. They were part of something much larger, a network of bonded pairs that was slowly growing across civilized space. The dragons were returning, not as the dominant power they had once been, but as partners and allies to the younger species who had inherited the galaxy. It was a responsibility that Marcus had not asked for and did not feel qualified to bear. He was just a cargo ship captain, a wanderer who had spent his life avoiding commitments and running from permanence. But the choice had been made, the bond had been formed, and there was no going back. He turned to his crew, Elena and James and Dr. Patel, all of them watching the screens with expressions of amazement and disbelief. He told them what he had learned through the bond with Spark. He told them about the eggs scattered across the galaxy and the darkness that the dragons had fought so long ago. He told them that their small cargo ship and its crew of 4 had somehow become part of a story that spanned millions of years. Elena asked what they should do now. It was a simple question without a simple answer. Marcus thought about it. He thought about the colony they had just saved, the sick children who were now getting the medicine they needed. He thought about the raiders they had driven off, the pirates who might think twice before attacking helpless ships again. He thought about all the problems in the galaxy that needed solving, all the people who needed help, all the dark corners that needed light. He said they would keep doing what they had always done. They would carry cargo and help people and travel the stars. But now they would do it with a dragon at their side, with power they barely understood, with a purpose that was larger than anything they had imagined. And when they found other eggs, other beings who needed guidance in forming their bonds, they would be there to help. They would teach what they had learned and share what they had discovered. They would be part of the network that was slowly bringing the dragons back. Dr. Patel smiled at that. She said it sounded like they were becoming something between cargo haulers and dragon ambassadors. Marcus laughed and said that was about right. James asked if the Wandering Hope was really the right ship for such an important mission. It was old and battered and barely held together by his constant repairs. Maybe they should find something better, something more suited to galactic exploration. Spark made a sound that was clearly disagreement. The dragon had formed a bond not just with Marcus, but with the ship as well, with the metal corridors where it had hatched and the crew that had welcomed it. The Wandering Hope was home now, and no other vessel would do. They spent another day exploring the ancient city, gathering images and data that might help others understand what they had found. Dr. Patel discovered a chamber that seemed to contain medical knowledge, techniques for healing that human science had never imagined. James found engineering workshops where the dragons had built their impossible machines. Elena located what might have been a library filled with crystals that contained the recorded history of a civilization older than Earth itself. They could not take everything, could not even comprehend most of what they found. But they took what they could. And they promised to return when they had the resources to study this place properly. The dragon's legacy was too important to ignore, too valuable to leave buried and forgotten. Before they left, Spark led Marcus to one more chamber. This one was small and intimate, with walls that glowed with soft light. In the center sat a single crystal, larger than the one that had contained Spark's egg, but clearly the same material. Inside it, Marcus could see a shape curled in on itself. Another egg, sleeping and waiting. The dragon looked at Marcus with an expression that was clearly a question. Should they take it? Should they bring another egg out into the universe to find its own partner? Marcus thought about it carefully. He thought about the responsibility that came with such power. The danger if the wrong person formed a bond with a dragon. He thought about how lucky he had been that Spark had found him, that their partnership had turned out well. But he also thought about all the good that could be done, about colonies that needed protection, about people who needed help, about the darkness that still waited somewhere beyond the stars. One dragon could make a difference. Two could make more. He carefully lifted the crystal and carried it out of the chamber, cradling it like the precious thing it was. Spark walked beside him, purring with satisfaction. They returned to the ship together, the newest member of their crew sleeping peacefully in its ancient container. The journey home was quiet. The crew processed what they had learned, adjusting to the new reality they now lived in. Elena spent hours organizing the data they had collected, preparing reports that would eventually change humanity's understanding of their place in the universe. James made improvements to the ship's systems using ideas inspired by what they had seen in the dragon workshops. Dr. Patel studied the medical knowledge they had recorded, finding treatments that might save countless lives. Marcus sat in his captain's chair, Spark curled up in his lap, and thought about the future. The universe was vast and ancient and full of mysteries. The dragons were returning after millions of years of sleep. Humanity was taking its first steps into a galaxy that was far more complex and dangerous than they had ever imagined. But that was all right. Humans had always faced the unknown with courage and curiosity. They had left their home world and spread across the stars. They had built colonies on harsh worlds and explored the depths of space. They had never backed down from a challenge, never given up when the odds were against them. And now, they had dragons. Marcus smiled and scratched Spark behind the ears. The creature made a sound of contentment and nestled closer. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Human and dragon, partners in an adventure that was only beginning. The wandering Hope sailed on through the stars, carrying its precious cargo toward an uncertain but hopeful future. Behind them, the ancient world of the dragons spun silently in its orbit, keeping its secrets until the day when more travelers would come to learn its mysteries. Ahead of them, the galaxy waited. Full of dangers and wonders and eggs waiting to be found. It was, Marcus thought, a good time to be alive, a good time to be human, and a very good time to have a tiny dragon sitting on your shoulder. Spark opened one golden eye and looked at him with an expression that suggested the feeling was mutual. Then it closed its eye again and went back to sleep, dreaming dragon dreams of fire and flight and the eternal bond between two very different beings who had found each other across the vast emptiness of space. The stars continued to shine. The ship continued to fly. And somewhere in the cargo hold, wrapped in crystal and waiting for its moment, another egg began to glow with the faint warmth of awakening life. The story was far from over. In many ways, it had only just begun.